For more than a decade, Lynette Hooker chased the life most people only dream about. She sold her home, left behind the ordinary routines of life, and moved aboard a sailboat with the man she'd been married to for 25 years. Together, they crossed turquoise Caribbean waters, documented sunsets for thousands of followers, and called their boat Soulmate. Then, on what should have been a 5-minute dinghy ride back home, Lynette vanished. According to her husband, rough seas threw her into the dark waters off the Bahamas. She disappeared while holding the only key capable of starting the dinghy's engine. He says he spent hours paddling alone through the night before finally reaching shore. But investigators would soon uncover details that transformed a tragic accident into something far more unsettling. The sailboat's tracking system stopped transmitting for more than 11 hours during the exact window Lynette disappeared. GPS data from her husband's own phone allegedly contradicted the location he gave police. Federal investigators seized both boats, sent evidence to an FBI laboratory in Quantico, and quietly began examining whether this wasn't an accident at all, but the possible murder of an American citizen in foreign waters. No one has been charged. Lynette Hooker has never been found. Tonight, we're going to walk through every documented fact, every contradiction, and every unanswered question to ask the one thing investigators still can't answer. What really happened to Lynette Hooker? Went into the water. Welcome to the evidence room. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because every week we lay out a real, unresolved case piece by piece, the way an investigator would, using only what has actually been documented. Like this video if true crime done carefully is your thing, and leave a comment with your gut instinct on this one, because we are going to walk through every piece of evidence together, and by the end, you may land somewhere you didn't expect. This is the story of Lynette Hooker. It begins not with her disappearance, but with the life she built in the years before it, because to understand what investigators are now calling one of the strangest missing persons cases in the Caribbean, you have to understand who she was, who she married, and what was happening beneath the surface of a marriage that looked, from the outside, like a dream. Lynette Hooker grew up around water. Her mother, Darlene Hamlet, would later tell reporters that her daughter had spent her entire life near lakes, on boats, swimming and sailing, almost as if the ocean were written into her. By the time she reached her 50s, Lynette had made a decision that a lot of people only talk about at dinner parties. She quit her career, sold her house in Michigan, gave away most of what she owned, and moved onto a sailboat with her husband of around 25 years, a man named Brian Hooker. Together, Brian and Lynette spent more than a decade sailing the United States and the Caribbean aboard a boat they named Soulmate. They built an entire identity around that life. They ran a YouTube channel called The Sailing Hookers, posting videos of sunrises over open water, dinners cooked in a solar oven bolted to the deck, storms weathered with a laugh and a shrug. On Instagram, Lynette described the ocean as her happy place. The footage shows her snorkeling beside sea turtles, swimming with manatees, her hair soaked and her face lit up with something that looked, unmistakably, like joy. Almost every photo includes Brian somewhere nearby. From a distance, it was the kind of life people quit their jobs dreaming about. But somewhere underneath that highlight reel, there were cracks. And once investigators started looking, those cracks became very hard to ignore. Court records reviewed by reporters show that both Brian and Lynette Hooker had brushes with the law years before any of this happened. In 2006, Brian was charged with child abuse and was acquitted. In 2015, Lynette was arrested on an assault-related charge after she and Brian accused each other of assault during an altercation. A warrant was ultimately denied because investigators could not determine who started the fight. Neither incident, on its own, tells you much. People have messy pasts. But it establishes something important for what comes later: this was not a couple without conflict. This was not a fairy tale with no documented friction. That friction surfaced again in a more direct way in late 2024, about a year and a half before Lynette vanished. According to messages reviewed by CBS News, Lynette told a friend and fellow boater named Marnie Stevenson that she had temporarily left Brian and gone to stay with her mother in Florida. In Lynette's own words, shared with her friend, their 25-year marriage had lasted, in her phrase, 6 weeks of actual cruising together before it became too much. She told Marnie it had been real bad, that she couldn't be out there with him, and that she wasn't going back. Marnie and her husband, Blaine Stevenson, had met the Hookers while sailing through Florida the year before, in 2023, and had spent real time with them on the water. They were not strangers reading a headline. They were friends watching something happen up close. And yet, Lynette did go back. By 2026, she and Brian were sailing together again, posting together again, still putting that same warm, sun-drenched version of their life online. Whatever happened during that separation, whatever conversation brought her back aboard Soulmate, it is not something the public record can answer. What the record can tell you is that this marriage had already broken once, quietly, 2 years before it ended up at the center of a federal investigation. Neighbors who watched Brian and Lynette Hooker from across the street in Onstead, Michigan, describe a different version of this marriage than the one captured in sunset photos. A woman named Jordan Plentz, 29 years old, lived directly across from the couple. She told the Detroit News she wasn't shocked when she heard Lynette had vanished. They fought for a long time, Plentz said, and in her words, the violence was pretty bad. Plentz said she had learned much of what she knew from Lynette's own mother, who had lived with the couple for periods of time and witnessed the relationship firsthand. Plentz said she never learned exactly what the fights were about, only that they had been happening for years, and that they were serious enough for a neighbor across the street to notice and remember. That account lines up with a police report later obtained by reporters, describing a domestic violence call to the Hookers' home in 2015 in more detail than typically becomes public. According to that report, Brian told officers Lynette had struck him 4 to 5 times in the face. Lynette told officers Brian had hit her first, in the forehead, before choking and punching her once. Officers documented a swollen, bloody nose on Brian. They documented no visible injuries on Lynette. She was the one taken into custody that night, spending a single night in a county jail before the warrant against her was ultimately denied, because investigators could never determine, with any confidence, who had actually started it. None of that, on its own, tells you what happened on a dinghy 11 years later. But it tells you the marriage Brian and Lynette Hooker described publicly, in sun-bleached photos, paddleboard videos, and a TikTok bio describing themselves simply as a married couple living their best life, was not the whole story. Underneath the highlight reel was a relationship with at least one documented history of physical violence, serious enough that police had been called to their home and one of them had spent a night behind bars. It's a familiar pattern in cases like this one. Two people build an entire public identity around adventure, gratitude, and sunsets, while something far more complicated plays out off-camera. It doesn't mean every smiling photo is a lie. It just means an Instagram feed was never built to hold the whole truth of a 25-year marriage, and investigators have learned, the hard way, not to mistake one for the other. Now, let's go to the night everything changed. Hopetown sits on Elbow Cay, a narrow strip of land in the Bahamas Abaco Islands, known for its candy-striped lighthouse and the sheltered, turquoise water of the Sea of Abaco just beyond it. It's the kind of place experienced sailors like the Hookers had visited many times before, calm by day, but capable of turning rough and unpredictable once the wind picks up after dark, which is exactly the condition Brian Hooker says they were caught in. On the evening of April the 4th, Brian and Lynette Hooker had dinner at the Abaco Inn in Hopetown, a small, postcard-pretty island in the Bahamas Abaco chain. Sometime around 7:30 in the evening, they climbed into their dinghy, an 8-foot inflatable boat, to make the short trip back to Soulmate, which was anchored nearby. According to Brian, the water was rough that night. Strong wind and choppy seas tossed the small boat around, and at some point, Lynette went overboard. Critically, Brian says she went into the water still holding the key to the dinghy's engine, which meant that the moment she fell, the engine died with her. It's worth understanding why that detail matters mechanically. Many small outboard dinghies use a kill switch key attached to a short lanyard, a safety feature specifically designed so that if the operator is thrown from the boat, the engine cuts out instantly rather than continuing to run, unmanned, with the propeller still spinning. In other words, the very thing that stranded Brian Hooker that night is also the thing that's supposed to happen, by design, in exactly this kind of emergency. Whether that detail supports an accidental fall or simply describes how the equipment is engineered to behave either way is something investigators have had to weigh carefully. In a recorded account he later gave to a friend, Brian described the moment in stark terms. "The wind blew them apart," he said, and Lynette began swimming toward the sailboat while he tried to recover control of the now powerless dinghy. He told that friend they lost sight of each other almost immediately, right around sundown, and that what followed was, in his words, a cascade of failures. Neither of them was wearing a life jacket. The light was fading fast. And somewhere in that widening gap of churning, darkening water, his wife of 25 years disappeared. Brian says he paddled for hours after that, alone, in the dark, trying to make it back to land. He finally reached the Marsh Harbor boatyard at around 4 o'clock in the morning on April the 5th, where he told someone what had happened. That person called the police. Within hours, the Royal Bahamas Police Force and the United States Coast Guard had a search underway. The absence of life jackets, while it might sound shocking, is unfortunately common among experienced, long-term cruisers making short hops between an anchored sailboat and shore. After years of routine dinghy rides, many sailors grow complacent about a trip that, on a calm night, takes only a few minutes. Investigators have not suggested this detail alone is suspicious. It simply meant that when conditions turned, on this particular night, there was nothing keeping Lynette afloat except her own strength as a swimmer, the same strength her daughter would later point to as a reason this story didn't sit right with her. This wasn't a quiet, low-key search. Within the first day, the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team, the Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and the United States Coast Guard had all mobilized, combing the water around Elbow Cay and Aunt Pat's Bay, the area where Brian said Lynette was last seen swimming towards Soulmate. Boats crisscrossed the channel for days, the kind of response usually reserved for cases where authorities still believe, genuinely, that someone might be found alive. As the days passed without any sign of Lynette, that search began to shift in tone, from a rescue operation into something closer to a recovery effort, and, before long, into a full criminal investigation. The tools involved in that search are worth a moment of explanation, because they show up again and again throughout this case. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect the specific scent compounds released by human decomposition, even underwater or through a hull, and can signal an area of interest long before divers ever go in. Underwater drones, sometimes called remotely operated vehicles, let investigators scan the seafloor in places too deep or too hazardous for a diver to search efficiently, feeding live video back to a boat on the surface. Used together, they let a relatively small team cover miles of open water in days rather than weeks, which is exactly why, 2 months after Lynette vanished, investigators were able to move so quickly once the corrected coordinates pointed them somewhere new. If you're keeping track of every detail here, type watching in the comments, because the next stretch is where this story starts to fracture under its own weight. Search and rescue crews brought Brian back out to the area where he said Lynette had gone overboard, and according to a family friend, Blaine Stevenson, Brian searched alongside rescue personnel for roughly 3 to 4 hours that morning. Afterward, those same officials brought him back to Soulmate, where he reportedly stayed for about 24 hours before returning to land. On the surface, this reads like a grieving husband doing everything he could. A man who lost his wife, desperate, exhausted, clinging to whatever hope remained that she might still be found alive. But here is where the story gets complicated, because while Brian Hooker was telling investigators and friends a fairly consistent account, rough seas, a sudden fall, a desperate search, something else was happening in the background, recorded automatically, without anyone's input or intention. Soulmate, like most large sailboats, was equipped with something called an Automatic Identification System, or AIS. It's a transponder that constantly broadcasts a vessel's identity, speed, and exact position, both to other boats nearby and to maritime authorities. It is, in plain terms, a trail. A digital trail that doesn't lie, doesn't forget, and doesn't have a reason to protect anyone. To understand why this single piece of equipment matters so much, it helps to know what AIS actually is. It isn't some obscure, specialized tool, it's standard equipment on most boats. Soulmate size, originally designed to prevent collisions at sea by letting nearby vessels see each other's position in real time. As a byproduct, it also creates an automatic, time-stamped record of exactly where a boat has been, logged independently by outside tracking services with no connection to the boat's owner. That's precisely what makes it so valuable to investigators. Unlike a witness, unlike a husband retelling a traumatic night from memory, AIS data doesn't have a version of events. It just has coordinates and timestamps. According to records later obtained by Fox News Digital through the marine tracking company Vessel Finder, Soulmate's AIS system went dark at 29 minutes past 9 in the evening on April the 4th. It did not come back on until 8:40 the following morning. That is a blackout of more than 11 hours, covering almost the exact window in which Lynette Hooker disappeared. Maritime experts who reviewed that gap said it told a very specific story. If an AIS system fails completely and permanently, that usually points to a hardware malfunction, a dead battery, a blown fuse, bad wiring. But this system didn't fail permanently. It went dark, and then, hours later, it came back to life on its own. According to one expert who reviewed the data, that pattern is not what equipment failure looks like. That pattern is what it looks like when a system is deliberately switched off, and then deliberately switched back on. To make matters more complicated, investigators later found 3 additional gaps in the AIS data between April the 10th and April the 13th, days after Lynette had already vanished, while the search for her was still actively underway. None of this proves what happened on the water that night. It proves, only, that the digital record does not match the simple story of an accident in rough seas. And once investigators noticed that mismatch, everything about this case changed. On Wednesday, April the 8th, Bahamian authorities took Brian Hooker into custody. Royal Bahamas Police Force Assistant Commissioner Eduardo Dames told reporters that Brian was detained as a suspect, based on what officials described as probable cause, though no formal charges were filed at that time. He was held for 5 days of questioning. During that period, something happened that almost sounds too strange to be real, but it is part of the documented record. While police were searching Soulmate one evening during his detention, Brian Hooker, who was handcuffed at the time, lost his balance and fell overboard, into water his attorney later described as choppy and dangerous. A man suspected in his wife's disappearance at sea ended up, briefly, in the water himself, restrained, during the very investigation into how she went missing. Make of that what you will. We're simply telling you it happened, because it did. It was also during this window that the public first heard from Lynette's daughter, Carly Aylesworth, who was 28 years old at the time and whose biological father is not Brian Hooker. Carly told reporters that her stepfather had called her just hours after reporting her mother missing, and that something about that call immediately raised questions in her mind. She described her mother's marriage to Brian as turbulent, rocky, in her words, saying that while the two of them clearly cared for each other, the relationship had, at times, turned volatile. Carly went further, telling reporters her mother had confided in her at some point that Brian had choked her during an argument. It's important to be precise here. CNN, which first reported this claim, said it was unable to independently confirm that allegation with law enforcement. It is something Carly says her mother told her. It is not, as of this recording, a confirmed fact, and Brian Hooker has never been charged with any act of domestic violence. Carly wasn't done. In a separate interview with CBS, she said that in recent months, her mother and stepfather's relationship had involved a lot of fighting and drinking, and that she was, in her words, kind of questioning what actually went on in that dinghy. She also pushed back on the simplest explanation for how her mother could have ended up lost at sea, pointing out that Lynette wasn't a casual boater caught off guard by rough water. She was fit, strong, and had been sailing for more than 10 years, the kind of experienced swimmer, Carly argued, who doesn't just disappear into the water and never resurface, even in a bad storm. Steve Hansen, Carly's boyfriend, offered his own theory about why authorities hadn't filed charges despite the arrest, suggesting investigators were unlikely to move forward unless they found something concrete, like blood evidence or Lynette's body, and that detaining Brian in the meantime was a form of pressure rather than a conclusion. Brian Hooker's legal team pushed back firmly on all of it, with his lawyer saying he categorically denied every allegation Aylesworth had made and reiterating that he had done nothing wrong. Still, Carly was direct about where her instincts were pointing. She told reporters that her stepfather's account of that night, in her words, just didn't add up, and that she believed something might have happened to her mother beyond a simple accident. At the same time, she was careful to say she didn't want him to be in trouble if this truly was a freak accident. She said she just wanted the truth, and she didn't want the case quietly swept under the rug. Carly later launched a fundraiser to help cover the costs of the search and, if it came to it, a memorial for her mother, drawing contributions from thousands of strangers who had never met Lynette but felt invested in finding her anyway. Brian, for his part, spoke publicly only once in those early days, through a single Facebook post on an account that was otherwise almost entirely private. In it, he described himself as heartbroken over what he called a boat accident in unpredictable seas and high winds, one that caused his beloved Lynette to fall from their small dinghy near Elbow Cay. He wrote that desperate attempts were made to reach her, but that the wind and current drove them further apart, and that finding her remained his sole focus. He thanked the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team, the Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and the United States Coast Guard for their help. It was, on its face, the post of a devastated husband. It was also, notably, published only about 12 hours before Bahamian police arrived to take him into custody. Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, was somewhere between those two poles, grief and suspicion. She told the Associated Press she was glad to hear an arrest had been made, but that she still had many unanswered questions. She secured an expedited passport so she could travel to the Bahamas herself. Finding her daughter alive, she said, would be a miracle, but she was still counting on one. On Monday, April the 13th, after 5 days in custody and no charges filed, Brian Hooker was released. His attorney in the Bahamas, Terrell Butler, said simply that officials had no evidence to continue holding him, and that the law required his release. Reporters who watched him leave the police station in Grand Bahama said he did not answer questions on his way out. Butler described his client as very emotional, a man who needed time to recover from what he'd just been through. Authorities, however, were clear about one thing: Brian Hooker remained a named suspect in an open investigation, even without charges. What happened next surprised a lot of people who had been following the case closely. Just one day after telling a reporter he intended to remain in the Bahamas with what he called a sole focus on finding his wife, Brian Hooker left the country. His attorney said the sudden departure was because his mother back in the United States was terminally ill, and that he needed to be with her. Maybe that's exactly what it was. Maybe it's a man being pulled in two impossible directions at once, toward a missing wife and toward a dying parent, at the worst possible moment of his life. Or maybe, to the people already suspicious of his timeline, it looked like a man putting an ocean between himself and an active criminal investigation. Both readings exist in the public conversation around this case. Neither one has been proven. Type evidence in the comments if you've made it this far, because we're about to walk through the part of this case that turned it from a tragic accident story into a federal criminal investigation with international reach. In early May, the United States Coast Guard formally seized Soulmate and had it transported out of the Bahamas to Fort Pierce, Florida, for forensic examination. The boat was later moved again, to Fort Lauderdale, after investigators found they were unable to remove certain equipment from the vessel while it remained in the water. Evidence collected from the boat, along with material from Brian Hooker's personal electronic devices, was sent to an FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for processing, the kind of forensic infrastructure typically reserved for serious federal crimes, not for confirming an accidental drowning. Then, in early June, more than 2 months after Lynette disappeared, came the development that reopened the entire case. Investigators recovered GPS location data from Brian Hooker's cell phone, pulled from a marine navigation app he had been using that night. According to multiple officials who spoke to CBS News and Fox News Digital, that GPS data did not match the location Brian had originally given police as the spot where Lynette went overboard. Instead, it showed the dinghy traveling through an entirely different stretch of water that, because of his original statement, had never been searched at all. Tad DiBiase, a former federal prosecutor who has written extensively on cases where a homicide is prosecuted without a recovered body, weighed in publicly on what this contradiction could mean. From his review of public reporting, DiBiase explained that the foundation of probable cause in a case like this often comes down to exactly this kind of mismatch: a husband's own account of where his wife fell from a tiny 8-foot dinghy, compared against the cold, mechanical data from his own phone and his own boat's navigation system, data that, by every indication, tells a different story than the one he gave police. DiBiase was careful to note he had not spoken directly with the investigators on the case and was speaking from public information alone. But his analysis captured why this single piece of digital evidence carried so much weight. It's worth understanding why a missing body doesn't automatically end an investigation. Cases prosecuted without a recovered victim are rare, but they are not unheard of. DiBiase has spent much of his career studying exactly these situations, cataloging how prosecutors across the country have built homicide cases on circumstantial and digital evidence alone, when the physical evidence of a body simply isn't available. In general, these cases tend to live or die on exactly the kind of material now piling up around Lynette Hooker's disappearance: location data that contradicts a suspect's own story, a documented history that undercuts the innocent explanation, and a timeline that doesn't hold together under scrutiny. None of that means charges are coming in this specific case. It means the absence of a body is not, on its own, a legal dead end, which is part of why the Coast Guard's seizure of both boats, and the FBI's involvement out of Quantico, signal something more serious than a routine missing persons file. There's a reasonable question buried in all of this, too: why is an American federal agency, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, working alongside the FBI, leading a death investigation that technically happened in Bahamian waters? The answer comes down to jurisdiction. Lynette Hooker is a United States citizen, and under federal law, the U.S. government has authority to investigate, and potentially prosecute, crimes committed against its own citizens abroad, particularly when the case touches U.S.-flagged vessels and U.S. nationals returning to American soil. The Bahamas opened its own criminal investigation through the Royal Bahamas Police Force in the days after Lynette disappeared, and that investigation remains technically open as well. But once digital evidence pointed toward the possibility of foul play, U.S. agencies stepped in with resources the Bahamian government simply doesn't have at this scale: a Coast Guard cutter capable of carrying a full dive team across international water, and an FBI laboratory equipped to process digital and forensic evidence that would otherwise take months to analyze locally. That's part of why this case has moved as fast, and as visibly, as it has. It's effectively being worked by two countries' worth of investigators at once. On June 2, the United States Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norvell, a vessel roughly 154 feet long, arrived in Marsh Harbor carrying a specialized team of divers. Around the same time, a U.S. official told CBS News that Lynette Hooker's case was now being investigated as what the official called a possible foreign murder of a United States national. It is worth pausing on that phrase, because it is a significant escalation from where this case started. When CBS News pressed a Coast Guard spokesperson for confirmation, the spokesperson would not go that far, saying only that the agency could not indicate it was specifically a murder investigation
strong
at that
currents
time,
sweeping her
but
away.
confirming it
They had
remained
been
an open
chronicling
and
their
active
life on the
criminal
water on social
investigation.
media. But Lynette's
That
daughter tells us
distinction
their
matters.
relationship was volatile
Officials
and expressed
speaking on
suspicions
background used
before
the
the
word
arrest.
murder.
Harley, do you believe this was an
Officials
accident?
speaking on the record
I
would
feel
not.
like this was probably
2 days later,
pre-planned,
on
if
June the
anything.
4th, the
Like,
Coast Guard Investigative
it
Service
doesn't seem
formally
like just
seized
some
the 8-foot
accident.
dinghy
Today,
itself,
Lynette Hooker's
the
mother
small
told the
inflatable
Associated
boat at
Press
the
she was
absolute
glad
center
to
of this
hear about the
entire
arrest.
case,
What has
and
he
brought
said
it
in
aboard a
response to
Coast
the
Guard cutter
allegations
for
made
examination.
by his stepdaughter?
Investigators were seen on
the
camera surveying the dinghy
allegations,
and holding up a life
and
jacket.
he is
A
anxious
cadaver dog
to
was present during
defend
the
himself.
operation.
Hooker's attorney
Friends
also
of
telling
Lynette,
NBC News,
Blaine, and
Mr.
Marnie
Hooker
Stevenson
categorically and
told
unequivocally
CBS
denies
News
any
they were hopeful
wrongdoing,
this new
and he
evidence
has been
would finally
cooperating
bring
with
some measure of
authorities. The
justice,
couple has been
with
married
Marnie
for more
saying
than 2
simply that she
decades.
hoped it was a
In
step in the
2015,
right
police
direction.
responded to an incident
When
involving the couple
investigators take
where they
physical
accused each
custody of
other
a
of
small
assault.
vessel like
According
this
to the
one,
police
they're
report,
generally
Brian
looking
had
for a
visible
fairly
injuries.
specific
Lynette
list
was
of
arrested,
things:
but a
scrape
warrant was later
marks or
denied
damage on
over
the hull
insufficient
consistent
evidence as
or
to who started the assault.
with someone
Today,
falling
our
or
drone
being pulled
capturing the
overboard.
couple's boat
Any trace
Soulmate, now
evidence
docked
like
in this
blood,
harbor.
hair,
The U.S.
or
Coast Guard
fibers caught in
confirming
the
they're also
fittings,
conducting
and
a
physical
criminal
confirmation of
investigation
small
into
but
the
important
disappearance
details
of Miss
from the
Hooker.
husband's account. Like
So, George,
exactly
what
where
else
the
did Brian
ignition
Hooker's
key was
attorney
kept
tell
and
you
how
about what
easily it
happened
could
before
come
his
loose and
arrest?
rough. Water. None of the
Tom,
specific
she tells me that
findings
Brian
from this
Hooker actually
examination
retained
have
her
been made
services
public.
prior to his arrest, and that he
What
was
is
actually
public is
planning
that
on going on
investigators
another
consider the
rescue
dinghy
mission to try and
important
find
enough
his
to
wife.
formally
She
seize
tells
it
me
as
the next line
evidence,
of questioning.
rather than simply photograph it and let it go. On June the 6th, the renewed search officially began in the new search area identified by the corrected GPS coordinates, focusing on a stretch of the Sea of Abaco with water reaching depths of around 25 feet. For nearly a week, Coast Guard divers, underwater vehicles, drones, and a cadaver dog worked to thoroughly examine the newly identified area. Carly Aylesworth told ABC News she was simply grateful for the renewed effort, saying her mother had to be somewhere, and that any help finding her was deeply appreciated. On June the 8th, that search came to an end. The Coast Guard announced it had concluded its renewed effort, but a spokesperson declined to say what, if anything, the search had turned up. Officials said only that the disappearance remained under investigation, and that information would be released as it became available. By the time that search wrapped up, Lynette Hooker's disappearance had become a genuine national story, covered by every major network, dissected on true crime podcasts, and eventually given its own television special, an episode of Impact X Nightline built around interviews with Lynette's mother, her daughter, a childhood friend, and Brian himself. That level of attention cuts both ways. It keeps pressure on investigators to keep working the case. It also means a grieving mother, a suspicious daughter, and a husband who has never been charged with anything have all had to live out the worst weeks of their lives in full public view, with strangers online debating their every word. The Hookers' own social media became part of the story almost overnight. The Sailing Hookers account, once filled with sunsets and snorkeling clips, was flooded with comments from strangers analyzing every old photo and caption for hidden meaning, while Lynette's personal page, still public, still full of her diving and paddleboarding, turned into something closer to a memorial wall, with well-wishers leaving messages directly to a woman who might never read them. It's an uncomfortable side effect of a case like this going viral. The public record now includes not just Lynette's life, but the very public, sometimes uncomfortable spectacle of strangers grieving and speculating in real time, in the comments section of vacation photos she posted before any of this began. That is where this case stands right now. Lynette Hooker has not been found. No one, not Brian Hooker, not anyone else, has been charged with a crime in connection with her disappearance. Brian Hooker has consistently and repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, from his very first statement to police through every account he has given since. His attorney in Michigan, Crystal Marie Hauser, has publicly urged the public not to rush to judgment, a reminder worth taking seriously, because everything you've just heard is allegation, contradiction, and unresolved evidence, not a verdict. But here is what the documented record does show, laid end to end. A 55-year-old woman went into the water holding the only key that could start the boat's engine. The vessel's own tracking system went dark for more than 11 hours during the exact window she disappeared, then came back on by itself. The husband's account of where she fell does not match the location data recovered from his own phone. He was detained as a suspect for 5 days, released without charges, and left the country shortly after. Federal investigators have now seized both boats involved, processed evidence at an FBI laboratory, and, at least according to officials speaking on background, opened the door to investigating this as a possible murder. What happens from here genuinely depends on what investigators do with everything they've gathered. There are a few realistic paths forward. Bahamian prosecutors could decide, based on their own investigation, that there's enough to charge Brian Hooker locally, though, as his attorney has pointed out more than once, nothing recovered so far amounts to direct physical proof of a crime. U.S. federal prosecutors could pursue charges of their own, since federal law allows the United States to prosecute certain crimes committed against American citizens overseas, particularly once the evidence and the suspect end up back on U.S. soil, as Brian Hooker now is. Or, just as realistically, this case could stall out the way a lot of difficult, evidence-light cases do, not closed, exactly, but quietly slowing down as the months pass and no new evidence surfaces. Right now, nobody outside the investigation itself knows which of those three paths this is on. And somewhere in the middle of all of it is a 28-year-old daughter who says she just wants the truth, a mother clinging to the hope of a miracle, and a husband who says he has told the same story from the very beginning, no matter how many times the evidence has shifted underneath him. What's striking about this case, more than almost any other we've covered, is how much of it was never hidden at all. The AIS gap, the GPS contradiction, the prior domestic violence call, the neighbor's account, the daughter's doubts, none of it required a leak or a whistleblower. It came out through public records, sworn statements, and reporters simply asking the right questions at the right time. The mystery here was never about access to information. It's about what that information adds up to, and whether anyone will ever be able to prove it in a courtroom. What do you think happened on the water that night? Was this a tragic accident at sea, the kind that genuinely does happen to even experienced sailors in rough conditions, or does the evidence point somewhere darker? Tell us your theory in the comments below. We read every single one, and we will be back with updates the moment this case moves forward, because cases like this one are almost never finished the first time we cover them. If this case had you leaning forward, hit subscribe right now, because the Evidence Room covers stories exactly like this one every week, real cases, real documentation, no speculation dressed up as fact. This has been the Evidence Room. We'll see you in the next case.